Hi guys, and welcome to my first online tutorial for Gnomon on Vray. My name is Christopher Nichols. I've written a few DVDs on the subject of Vray for the Gnomon workshop, and this is my first online mini tutorial that I'm doing, and this is mainly focused on a very specialized section of Vray that's actually probably one of the most powerful elements of Vray, and that's anti-aliasing. The main reason that anti-aliasing is so powerful is the fact that it can basically control the entire quality of your scene, from anywhere from the lighting to the GI to everything. So there's a lot of things we're going to discuss and a lot of things we're going to miss, but because this tutorial could actually go on for a very long time. Could probably do a whole DVD on the subject, but I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more to the point and talk you through some of the different methods that are going on in anti-aliasing, and leave you with enough tools that you can experiment on your own and figure out what are the best settings for you to use. So before I start, I'm going to sort of walk you through some of the basic elements of anti-aliasing in Vray and what they mean, and let's start with that. Okay, so let's talk us through some of these different anti-aliasing methods. If you go to our render dialog and you go to render, you'll notice that basically we have different types of image samplers. This is in the anti-aliasing tab here, different types of image samplers and different types of anti-aliasing filters. The image sampler basically designates how Vray goes out there and gathers samples for its anti-aliasing. And there's different methods in which it can do that. And then the filter says what it does with those samples and how it would filter them down for a 1 pixel basis. So let's talk about slightly what those different samples are. You have basically fixed, adaptive QMC, and subdivision. If we look at fixed, for example, real quick, and we'll go through these in depth very shortly. Fixed basically is divided in subdivision. You'll see subdivision 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever you want to do. But it defaults at 1, which is what I want to try to talk about. And then we have our adaptive QMC. And right now I have that set to 1, 1, and there's a reason for this. And that basically has a minimum and a maximum value. And then there's these color threshold value in here. Okay, and basically there's a subdivision, the maximum amount of subdivision it does per pixel, and a minimum amount of subdivision per pixel, and the color threshold designates it'll go from the minimum up to the maximum amount of subdivisions, and until it reaches a subdivision, until it reaches a certain color threshold that it needs to. We'll go into more in depth of what that is in a second. And then we have our adaptive subdivision, which is slightly different. Notice it doesn't say subdivision here, it says rate. It's an adaptive subdivision and it's measured in rates. There's a minimum rate and a maximum rate, and again a color threshold here, and you can also use a normal threshold, outline, etc. But we're just mainly going to focus on rates here. And notice that rates are different from subdivisions that are measured here. Okay, so let's talk briefly what those subdivision methods are. Okay, so let's talk about subdivision first. Subdivision is actually fairly straightforward. This you guys may have recalled this from my first DVD for those of you that have it. This is sort of a refresher on that. This basically, let's imagine that this is the size of 1 pixel. A subdivision of 1 means 1 pixel. So you're sending out 1 sample for 1 pixel on a 1 subdivision. Subdivision of 2, fairly straightforward. You take your pixel and you divide it in 2 and 2. So you divide it by 2, that's actually 4 samples per pixel. Subdivision of 3 is 3 by 3, which is 9 samples per pixel. Subdivision of 4 is 4 by 4, 16 samples per pixel. Pretty straightforward, but keep in mind every time you go up, you're actually going up by a square of that value. Okay. Next is rate, which is actually even more accelerated in the way that it subdivides pixels. So let's talk about rate here. In rate, what we have is, imagine that this area here is 1 pixel. Okay, what you have when you do a rate of 1, you actually subdivide your area into a 2. Okay, 0, a rate of 0 is actually equivalent to a subdivision of 1. And then a rate of 1 is a magnitude up, so it's 2. Okay, and then a rate of 2 would actually take this and divide all of these by 2, okay, which would be a subdivision of 4. So a rate of 2 is equal to subdivision of 4. So what would a rate of 3 be? It would be divide all of these again by another one, and that would be 8. So a rate of 3 is a subdivision of 8. Okay. The advantage of rate is you can actually do what's called an undersampling. So a subdivision or a rate of -1 is equals to actually 4 pixels. Okay. So you can actually have only one sample done for 4 pixels. You can actually do what's called undersampling, which is a kind of an advantage in certain times where you know that there are certain areas where not much is changing, such as on a big blank wall or situations like that. Very common in large architectural models, etc. You can undersample those areas and actually go through the anti-aliasing very quickly. So you can actually do less anti-aliasing, etc. And then of course a -2 subdivision is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 by 8, so 64 pixels are in a -2 rate. Okay, so that gives you a basic overview of the difference between rate and subdivision, which is an important part of the understanding when we're going through these exercises. Okay, so now we had a little brief overview for some of you that might have been a refresher course if you'd already seen my DVD. But now we're going to talk about well, let's do a brief introduction of this scene. The scene is fairly straightforward. I basically have these pebbles here that I've modeled. I have a ground here, which actually has a grid texture on it. And I wonder if, well, you can't see it actually in this camera. Let's go to a default lighting situation. I have a grid texture, and then I have this wall here that I have a curved wall. Okay, and then for lighting on the scene, I basically have a single light source. That light source is actually in a dome light situation. Okay, with an HDR on it. In the scene, I'm going to give you the HDR. I will not provide for you. You'll have to provide your own HDR and do your own experimentation. This is just one that I'm using for the scene, and you guys can experiment with any one you want. With that said, these basic pebbles have these specialty blend shaders on them to get a little more reflection, etc. And I'll talk about blend shaders at some other point. But they basically have some extreme noise on them. You'll see there's actually several levels of noise that I've added to each one of these. If we look at the breakdown of the shader in the scene, you'll see that basically I have a lot of noise sort of breaking down for each pebble, and I have a clear code of reflection, and then I have a grid that has a reflection in it as well, which has got a Fresnel reflection in it, and that reflection has a glossiness. Important things to note about this glossiness is it's got a subdivision of 8, and the pebbles also have a subdivision of 8 on the glossiness. And then there's this wall, and the wall is basically just a gray wall that I'm using, sort of a 50% gray wall, and there's no glossiness on that wall, so straight diffuse wall. And then let's see what else is there. Okay, I have a subdivision of 16 on this light for the shadows. Okay, this particular light actually has the HDR, which has a bright light source in it, and it will cast a sharp shadow because of the way that V-Ray's dome lights work. So I have a subdivision of 16 on that shadow, and that's going to become a key factor in when we go through this process. So now you got a brief introduction to the scene. Now let's go forward and talk about our basic implementation of anti-aliasing and how it affects the quality of our scene. Okay, so let's start with the most basic anti-aliasing method, which is fixed. Okay, and basic doesn't necessarily mean bad, which we will soon find out. This subdivision of 1 means that basically it will shoot a ray out from the camera from that ray, several rays will go out and do different things for different methods. You'll have rays that measure the shadows, rays that measure the glossiness, etc. So one ray could actually sample itself several times in order to measure glossiness, can measure shadows, etc. And that is all designated by these different subdivisions for different areas. So you can control a subdivision for every little detail of the image, which is a good thing, but actually can be quite cumbersome at the same time. So what I've done in this particular tutorial is I have pre-rendered all of these images that I'm going to go through just for the sake of showing you what's going on and give you render times. These render times are actually the critical part of this whole aspect, because it basically shows how the quality changes versus the render time, which is the key factor to rendering in a anti-aliaser of this type, is to try to get the maximum quality in the shortest amount of time. Now that, of course, time is relative to the speed of your computer, and for the sake of this argument I just wanted to let you know that I did all of these renderings and all these render times are based on the renderings done on my laptop, to be honest. So the render times are actually much higher than you would have on a regular workstation. My laptop is, while fairly new, uses a Core 2 Duo processor. It's got 2 gigs of RAM. The Core 2 Duo is at 2 gigahertz, so it's a fairly fast processor for a laptop. But on all of these render times, you should expect a rendering time that is at least twice as fast for a workstation that is a normal workstation. If the or a fairly new workstation, if you're using a brand new workstation such as the new dual quad core processors, you can expect render times to go be cut in probably a quarter of what they are right now. Again, let's just go through quickly some of the other settings that we have in the scene before we get started immediately. I do have some GI going on. I have a QMC for the primary bounce and a light cache for the secondary bounce. The reason I'm using QMC and not a radiance map, that most of the work I do is based on animation, and so these type of anti-aliasers work really well for animated scenes as opposed to radiance map, which can be somewhat problematic for animated scenes with animated objects. So that's kind of my de facto method of working. Okay, so let's get started with the actual rendering. Okay, so we basically now I'm gonna show you the pre-rendered scene that comes with this image, and it's basically this right here. You'll notice obviously we have some serious anti-aliasing problems going on, but overall, for example, if you look here, there's a fine noise. There's definitely noise, but there's a fine noise in terms of what's happening in this wall. And the reason it's not a coarse noise is the fact that basically while the ray hit here, it was still able to bounce enough and collect enough samples in terms of the subdivisions of the light source, as well as subdivisions of the anti-aliasing of the glossy rays, etc. So all of these rays are able to sample, and the main problem we have is in the actual pure color map, which basically only has one subdivision. Okay, so now let's take this here and let's go ahead and subdivide it one more time. So we'll go to this subdivision here and take it to 2 and see what that gives us. So a subdivision to 2, notice our render times have gone up by from 249 to 346, but we've already got a large improvement in what's going on. Look at this wall, and you'll notice that basically nothing much has changed in that wall. That's because the subdivisions haven't really solved the problem of this wall. All they've really solved or started to solve are the problems of the fine color areas. So our render times are mainly dealing with this anti-aliasing problem. Okay, so go up again, and I like to go in factors of 2, so we're going to go to 4 subdivisions and see how that affects our render times. At 4 subdivisions, you'll notice we're already a lot better. Now this, in terms of everything that's the way it's looking, what's all of a sudden start to happen is that while this surface starts to look a lot better, the noise on this wall starts to become more noticeable relative to all the other noises that's going on. That's because at 4 subdivisions, you start to realize that there's not enough subdivisions on this wall to really take hold of it. So let's keep going and take it up to 8. And at 8 subdivisions, our render times have gone way up at this point. And you notice that at 8 subdivisions, this wall has started to look a lot better. And then in fact, our entire scene is a lot better. There's still noise here, absolutely some noise in these areas. But in general, we basically had to almost triple our render time in order to get to that level of quality. So we're at 18 minutes now in terms of render time at subdividing this by 8, which is at 1825. And again, remember, if we did this on a normal workstation, this would be about 9 minutes for this type of render, which, considering there's GI and it's all image-based lighting and glossy rays, etc., isn't bad at all. But nonetheless, it's a big jump in render time. Again, let's take this up to 16. Okay, and at 16, what we'll do is see that basically now at 16 rays, we're at an hour, which is a huge jump in time. This is basically going up by a factor of 3 again, but our scene is pretty much noise-free at this point. You're not going to see any noise in here at all. And our quality of our lines are just immaculate, and all of the fine speckled dots on these pebbles are actually in perfect shape. But see what happens. We were using a Vray camera, so I'm going to select that Vray camera, and I'm actually going to turn on this depth of field effect here. The depth of field effect in normal, if you haven't been using these specialty methods of anti-aliasing, will actually substantially increase your render times. But let's see what it actually does in this particular instance. I now introduced depth of field, and you'll notice we go from an hour 5 to an hour 7. And you're wondering, how is that possible? How did it barely affect our render times to introduce a depth of field effect in this method? The reason being that it already had plenty of samples to deal with all of these problems in the same way to deal with all the other problems in these zones. So introducing a depth of field, if you sample enough samples in your anti-aliasing, introducing things such as depth of field, motion blur, etc., do not affect your image that much. So the depth of field effect that's going on in our scene is actually virtually trivial once your anti-aliasing gets at a very high factor. And this is an important thing to note as we go on with this. Okay, now let's get on to another method of anti-aliasing, which would be QMC. Alright, so now let's hop over to adaptive QMC. In adaptive QMC, what we're actually doing is actually not just sort of brute force subdividing a pixel and getting lots of samples per that pixel. What we're actually doing is subdividing a pixel by a minimum amount, and then if there's a lot of noise within that pixel based on this noise number here, which is called a color threshold, we go up a subdivision. And if it's still too noisy, you go up another subdivision and another subdivision and another subdivision until it hits its maximum. Okay, so that color threshold says how far do we go until the noise is good enough, and the maximum says that's the farthest you can go. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and just do 1, 1 at 0.1 and see how that compares to fixed. And basically what you will see is, in that rendering, let's compare this to the first one of fixed 1. And you'll see this is at a render time here of 249, and then at 1.1 is 205, and it looks almost identical in terms of its problem of what's going on. There may be a little slightly more noise in here, which would account for the slightly shorter rendering time, but basically it's the same thing. 1.1 would be equivalent to fixed 1. But what I want to do is actually something a little more interesting. we have a huge anti-aliasing noise problem in our fine color lines in terms of the grain that's going on here and in terms of the grain that's going on here, but we don't have as much of a noise problem in terms of our our smoothness of our walls, our glossy rays here, our shadows here, etc. The reason, what I want to actually do is attack everything in one step. I don't want to have to adjust the subdivision of every single factor of the image. I want to attack it all in one, and the reason being that I can be much more adaptive in terms of the way that I attack a problem by creating by allowing everything to become what I call a noise problem. So adaptive QMC basically deals with everything as a noise problem if you do a few extra little steps in here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go into my random QMC sampler, okay, which is something that some people don't really use that much, but is actually very, very powerful. One thing you'll notice that this normally defaults at 0.85, and I've actually made it 1. I'm basically telling this the QMC engine in Vray to be as adaptive as possible, and then giving it a general color threshold of 0.01, but that doesn't really matter, because really what matters is this value here, which is the color threshold of the adaptive QMC image sampler. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this value here, and what this global subdivision multiplier is I'm just takes all the subdivisions that are in things like, for example, the camera depth of field. I'm going to turn that off for now. The camera depth of field, the let's see, the subdivisions on the glossies, the let's see what else, the shadows on the light. All of these are subdivided by a certain amount, and they have a multiplier of 1, so 1 times 16 is 16, etc., etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to 0.01, and that sort of multiplies everything down by a factor of 100. So since you can't have subdivision lower than 1, it'll pretty much make everything a subdivision of 1. Takes my light, makes it 1 in terms of the shadows, takes this, makes it 1, everything is 1. So we have a subdivision generally of 1, which will make the image look pretty bad. And let's see what that actually does. You'll notice that now we have a big noise problem, which in my mind is a good thing, because now we can attack the entire problem of noise in terms of color of this wall, noise in terms of the shadows, noise in terms of the subdivisions here, everything as one problem, and that's going to be all dealt with in the anti-aliasing. This is a method that's introduced by Vlado, one of the main authors of Vray, and in terms of what he calls the universal settings. And what I've done basically in this presentation is to present it in a way that actually makes it a lot more, shall we say, useful, because his values that he introduces can be a little daunting for people to try to use. So I've sort of adapted his method of working into a way that I like to work. It's actually very useful for day to day, and but it's a very powerful thing. So the first thing to notice is basically we go from 2 minutes, 50-second render, very fast render, very noisy, but an even noise across the entire image. Okay, so now let's take this, once we've divided that to 1, let's just go ahead and start using more samples for image. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce 4 to the maximum value here and see what that does. So now basically you'll see that we've kind of attacked our problem here, and that we've gone and we've taken out a lot of noise. It's not, the wall is not as smooth here as it is here, but these areas are certainly starting to look better in terms of their lines, etc., etc. And our render time is still very low. It's at 1 minute 34. Okay. Now, here's an important thing to notice, and the best way for me to talk about it is actually to render this out and show you what it actually means. So I'm going to do a quick render and talk about it. But basically, look at the problem here. The problem here is that now all of our noise exists in dark areas, or there's more noise in dark areas than there is in bright areas, and this dark area problem is kind of a weird thing, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. So first thing I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and render this and pause the video and talk about it in the render, because that's the easiest way for me to explain it to you guys. Okay, so basically here's the render. And the way I render, as a lot of you should be rendering, is in linear space. So I keep all my data linear, and I just use the Vray frame buffer to show me what it actually looks like in correct monitor space. So let's look at this area here. And the way you do it in Vray is to display an sRGB color space for the monitor. But if I turn that off, I'm actually looking at the raw linear data through the monitor, which is significantly darker. But if you do that, you'll notice that the noise problem is even throughout, and the dark areas actually look like they're the same, match the same kind of noise problem. The minute I turn this sRGB on, the noise is much worse in the blacks than it is in the white areas. Why is that? That's because Vray sees noise like this, and I'm seeing noise through my monitor this way. So what I'm need to do is I need to get Vray to see noise through in the same way that I do, which is through my monitor. So let me turn this off and show what happens if I go into my color mapping and I have turned my gamma to a 2.2, which is approximately matching an sRGB color space. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do a render again. And what you'll notice is that basically the blacks now have gone away in terms of the noise, or not gone away, they've substantially reduced the noise, and that the noise pattern is kind of even across the entire image again. But this is linear data, and it looks like it's sRGB corrected data, which for my monitor, which is wrong, because if I actually turn on sRGB, now it's way too bright. So my data is incorrect. So what I need Vray to do is to see noise like this, but keep the data so that I can still be able to use it in linear color space. So how do I do that, which is kind of a difficult thing? Well, this is kind of a new thing to Vray. Is there's this little function here which is extremely powerful, and it allows you to have Vray see everything in the color mapping through whatever numbers you throw here, but not actually render them. And this includes the way it sees noise. So if I turn on don't affect color adaptation only, so it'll only use this color mapping for the adaptive nature of Vray. You can set your gamma value here, but it won't actually render. So what does that actually look like from here? It will look like this. Now notice our render times have gone up because it's had to solve for more noise, but the noise is a lot more even. This is before the gamma correction, this is after, before and after. See, so all of our black problems have become less problems. Nothing, I mean anything else by that statement, but basically all of the noise that we have in the black areas have gotten a lot better just by setting the gamma in that way. And now we're back to an even noise across the whole board here, which is good. So let's go to the next step. Okay, so basically what we need now is we need to basically have more samples in our scene, because 4 is just not going to cut it, and we need to just go up in a value. So I'm going to go ahead and take this up to 4. Okay, when I do that, basically we'll notice that here's at 4, sorry, I'm going to take it up to 8 is what I meant to say. At 4, our value is, our image looks like this, and then I take it to 8, and look what happens. There is barely any difference at all between 4 and 8, and the render times have not gone up at all. Why is that? It's actually a very simple reason for that. This color threshold, it never goes up to 8. It just keeps going till about probably between 3 and 4, maybe goes up to 5 in some cases, and then cuts out. It says good enough, no problem, don't need to add anymore. So basically our color threshold is too high. We need to say I want a finer threshold of color to sample to. So we're going to go ahead and cut this in half to 0.05. and see what happens to our image. Okay, so if I cut this down to 0.05, you'll see that, boom, now it cuts the noise in literally half, and the render times go up a little more than double. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on when you start to cut your noise threshold. You can basically adaptively go in there and lower the amount of noise through this noise threshold. There's only so far you can go because this is the maximum subdivisions you have, right? So you can't really go much lower than that. So let's go ahead and close this window. So at 8.05, this is kind of what our image is looking at. Render times are still fairly good. Okay, at 441, again, remember this is on my laptop. On a regular computer, this would be about 2 minutes 20 seconds or so. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go ahead and cut this down to 16 again. Okay, 16. Go here. Again, we're dealing with the same problem as we were before. Too much noise threshold. Okay, so we need to lower the noise, the color threshold in our anti-aliaser again. So I'm going to go ahead and lower it to 0.02. Okay, to a little, more than half, about 2/5 of what it was. Okay, what does that do? Okay, we're now way better in terms of our noise. And notice another thing that starts to happen. You start to see this gets crisper, this gets sharper, everything else, all this noise goes away. But little things that are important is that the reason I chose these pebbles is they have a lot of very fine little speckles to them. And then if you don't sample them enough, they basically lose that speckle. You don't get them. They kind of get averaged out of the scene. So I'm going to basically look at this image and say, okay, that's fine, but there's still a slight amount of noise in here, and I want to lower that a little bit more. Okay, 14 minutes, we're in good shape. Remember what we had before. To have this level of noise in the other method using fixed, we didn't have. This was very fine, but this was at an hour. We're now at 14 minutes, so we've basically cut down our problem from our fixed method to about a quarter, or to more than a quarter, less than a quarter in terms of what it was. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to take this down even further and do 0.01 and see how that affects my image. Okay. At 0.01. Whatever remaining noise was there in this wall, for example, and here, all these little dots have gotten slightly crisper. Everything has gotten just slightly better. Okay, render times have gone up by about double the render times. Okay, so all of this has happened. Now, but this is a very fine image. And it's half an hour, so it's half the time that it was at fixed of the same value. Okay, because it adaptively doesn't need to go that high, which is a good thing. Now this is also, keep in mind, this is a real torture test for anti-aliasing. I have tons of noisy issues here. I'm using a big HDR for image-based lighting with sharp shadows and highlights. I'm using glossy rays on these reflections here. So there's a lot of sampling that everything has to do for absolutely every pixel. So on a smooth surface, this could probably go way faster in terms of the difference between fixed and QMC. But this is a kind of a good torture test for what's going on. So let's do what we did last time and go ahead and turn on the depth of field, and you'll notice that when I turn on depth of field, again, we're not affecting our render times that much because it basically it already has been sampling these a great deal, and it wasn't that much more of an effort to get you the depth that you needed for your depth of field. And now you get basically a depth of field effect at 30 minutes on my laptop for a scene like this, which is actually a fairly good render time. And if you would do this on a new computer, on a fairly new workstation, you could expect to get a rendering like this in about 15 minutes. This is at video res, at D1 res, and if you had a brand new one with a quad core, you probably get this down to about 7 minutes, I would guess, which is a really good rendering time considering all the amount of glossy rays and anti-aliasing and GI and everything else that's going on in this scene. Okay, so that breaks down QMC for you. So now let's look at the next one. Okay, so now we're going to talk about adaptive subdivision and see what that does. Adaptive subdivision, as you may recall from the beginning, works in rates, and the default value actually has a negative rate, so it actually will undersample to start with and go up to 2, which, as we know in terms of subdivisions, is a subdivision of 8. So it's going from 2 pixels to a subdivision of 8 pixels. Actually, sorry, 4 entire pixels to subdividing a single pixel into 8 pixels. And with a color threshold of 0.1. And let's see what that actually gives us in this scene. I am actually going to go in here and turn that back on to 1 because it doesn't make any sense to do that for adaptive subdivision in the same way that it does for QMC. But let's go ahead and see what that does. Now, you'll notice a few things. And this happens a lot to people, so it's a good place to pay attention. One, this wall, the render times are actually pretty long for this scene. 7 minute 31, which is halfway between when we did a maximum of 8 and 16 for our scene in the in our QMC. All right, so this is a pretty long render time, but there's a few things that you'll notice. The good news is that this wall is fairly smooth fairly quickly, as well as all the gray spaces here. There's noise there, but it's fairly low, relatively speaking. You'll notice these gaps between these lines. Okay, why is that? The reason being that it probably undersampled a pixel here and skipped this entire pixel of what this line could be, because it just skipped it. Because adaptive subdivision will undersample a great deal, which is great for surfaces like this, but bad for surfaces like this and bad for surfaces like this. You'll notice these huge gaps of noise and just trying to smooth this rock without creating any of the speckles in these areas. So adaptive subdivision can actually undersample quite a bit. Let's actually look at what that is. And I'm going to do a quick render here. I never actually did this rendering. I'm just going to show you off the bat. If I take my min rate to -1, look at what it actually does. I'm going to go ahead and pause the render. So what you'll notice is that the undersampling kind of ignores a lot of areas here. Kind of creates this dot, and you notice it doesn't break it up like a pixel. It kind of blends. It's trying to blend the pixel next to it as much as possible, or the sample next to it. So it's almost as if you blew up a picture in Photoshop that was very low resolution, and it creates this blending effect. And that's different from the image sampler, which doesn't, the fixed or the QMC, which doesn't blend like this. It just basically creates noise. So the blending is actually what's causing us a problem in our image here, is that it's blended out the line. So let's go ahead and add more pixels to the, a higher rate for the minimum to this scene, so that we can see what happens there. So I'm going to actually, it was at -1, so this and -2, so I'm going to go ahead and do 0. Okay, what is this equivalent to in the QMC world? 0 is a subdivision of 1, and 2 is a subdivision of 8. So it's at 21.1. Okay, so we're at 21.1, and then here we'll notice that we've started to regain some of our lines in this area, but what we've really gained a lot of is our noise on our pebbles. Okay, so different areas have different types of gain. Our wall has virtually unchanged from this whole experience. Okay, mainly we're dealing with the fine areas. Okay, so the advantage of the subdivision is that large smooth surfaces come to correct values much quicker, but small detail areas have serious problems when you're dealing with, not serious problem, they have problems when dealing with adaptive subdivision in terms of the anti-aliasing. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and render this at this rate, and I'm going to unpause it to show you what's going on with the RAM. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and just show you what's going on with RAM. So why don't we just do this? We'll just bring up the task manager and ignore the rendering time. Notice we're at about 1 gig of RAM right now. That's going to have a lot of things loaded, so it's really not all max it's using the RAM. But I'm going to go ahead and hit render here and see what happens to the RAM as we start to go up in our render time. Okay, when we use adaptive subdivision for our anti-aliaser, the maximum value actually ends up affecting our RAM. And I'm not going to go too much in depth into this, but suffice it to say that you have to be very careful how high you set your maximum value, because your RAM will go up. As opposed to QMC, notice it was 0.03 after it's done the light cache, and then now it'll start to render. Actually, I think I have subdivision depth of field on, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. It'll render. Let's do that one more time, sorry, as I talk through this problem. Notice it'll start to, the render times will, the RAM will go up slightly once it starts the anti-aliasing process. Won't go up much in this specific case because my rate is at 2. Okay, I'm actually I'm going to almost ignore this image. I don't want you to actually look at the image. I want you to look at what's going on in the RAM as the max rate goes up. Okay. Okay. Now it started the rendering process right here, and you notice the RAM has gone up slightly as it starts to actually do the rendering. Okay. Hasn't gone up much, but it has gone up. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and cancel this, and I'm going to take this value to 3. Okay, and let's see what happens to the rendering time. Starting to light cache. Trying the lights. It's a big light source. Now it's building a light cache. Okay, so before it did the light cache, that's 0.03, which is where we were before. As it's starting to render, the RAM will start to go up a little bit. Okay, it's climbing, it's climbing. Okay, it's gone up about 60 megs or so. Okay, and it will stay at that method, at that rate, as it's actually going through this render process. Okay, this is dependent on your bucket size mainly. And let's see the subdivisions here, 0.06. Okay, now let's take it up to 4. It's going through its light building, light cache, and notice what happens to the RAM as we go through this process. Sorry, this is a little bit more tedious part, but it's an important part to remember that don't just willy-nilly add more and more subdivisions to your image, because your sample rate can go way up. Okay, it's actually not that bad. Let's see what happens when we actually go in here and subdivide that, lower the color threshold on that. We'll go through to what that actually does in the image in a second. I just want you guys to see what happens with the RAM. I've often, basically what I'm getting down to, the fact is this, is when I start to really pump up the settings of the adaptive subdivision, and lowered the color threshold, I've run out of RAM and crashed max, even at just a video res, because it pumps so many samples into the image. And it operates basically very differently because it kind of keeps everything in memory as it has all these samples in there. So you notice our RAM just keeps going up. If you do this in QMC mode, your RAM wouldn't actually go up. It would stay the same. And this is just going to keep going up until basically Vray will crash, which is not a good thing because basically it has to keep everything in memory as it's going through there. It's just adding more and more samples as it's going through there, trying to find the best color threshold, and you're going to eventually run out of RAM. Not a good thing. So something to keep in mind when you're using adaptive subdivision, if you use adaptive subdivision, I actually don't even use it anymore. Be very careful when you start to really pump up these settings because your RAM will actually just become a problem. And this will not be the case when you use QMC. Okay, so instead of letting Max crash, I'm just going to go ahead and cancel this process because it'll actually crash it and go back to where we were. And that was at 0, 2, and 0.1. Okay, so let's go ahead and take the rate to 3 and see what happens. So we're at 0 to 0.1, and now we go to 3, and you notice that our lines are starting to fill in a little bit better, but obviously it's still nothing compared to what we would have before, but generally speaking we're a lot better. Again, we're at 10 minutes, so we're already almost reaching what we were in terms of the better quality image when we're using QMC, but it's still having a lot of problems with these little fine lines in this area. So what do we have to go from here? I'm not going to go to 4, so I'm actually going to lower the color threshold. And I'm going to lower that to 0.05, similar method that we did before. And what does that look like? 0.05, notice that literally these little dots that weren't there start to appear, and our lines are starting to fill in a little bit more. Okay, doubled our render time to do that. We're now at 22 minutes, but it's looking a lot better. Again, like I said, this wall is almost perfect, but we still have problems here, still have problems there. These lines aren't filled in, generally speaking. So certain things get really well addressed with adaptive or adaptive subdivision, and certain things do not. Okay, so what's the next step? As you know, I don't necessarily want to go too crazy on these values, especially on the max value, because I know that it will actually create a problem in terms of my RAM. So my only bet is I can lower the color threshold. So I'm going to lower that to 0.02 and see what that gets us. And that gives us an hour and 6 minutes. At this point, this is in really good shape. But you still have a little bit of problems here. In fact, the fix 16, which took just as long to render as this, looked better here. But this is just completely smooth. Like this line here, everything is just beautifully smooth. Still have noise here. So kind of have to have a balance between what's going on. But fix 16 is actually better than this and the same render time. So just keep that in mind. Then what happens if I go in here and I actually add a depth of field effect to this image? What you'll notice is that when I do that, depth of field comes in, etc. My render times double. Okay, so we're now at 2 hours and 18 minutes to add an effect like depth of field, and this is just an increasing problem for the whole process because basically adaptive subdivision just does not work well with glossy effects, glossy rays, glossy shadows, glossy things in general. It does not work as well with it. It works really well with plain white diffuse surfaces, which is great for architectural surfaces, but not for glossy effects. So hopefully with this, you guys have gotten a good idea of what's going on in terms of anti-aliasers. And let me just give you a brief rundown of what I use, and I by far do not consider this the way that you need to set things. But I'm just going to go ahead and run down, okay, now that you know this is what I like to use, and you be sure to use whatever method you want to do, and I would encourage you to experiment with anti-aliasing. You'll have this scene to try out and try different settings. But this is basically the settings that I like to use on my scenes. And of course, use your own scenes to try your own settings as well. But let me run down those basic settings that I like to use for when I do work in the real world. Okay, so what do I like to use in my everyday use? Well, the thing is, fixed of 1 and keeping the global subdivisions to 1. Setting your, let's take your light, for example, the light shadows on your lights to a good value, 16 in this case, but it could be 8 or whatever. Setting everything to kind of a standard value is good, and that gives you the power to get whatever you need in terms of a basic look. I can check lighting, I can check basic things all the time. If I need to get a little bit better, I like to take this to 2, and that gives me a little bit better preview if I'm doing a motion blur or I'm doing a depth of field, etc. Just gives me a little bit more of an idea of what that is. It's not going to be the final quality. This is just for fast and quick and dirty kind of looks of things. They generally work really, really well. Okay, so that's my my default values that I use for just checking out things and seeing if you know, my rendering is happening. Now when I start to get to the final quality image, I'm always going to probably pick adaptive QMC in most cases, and I will usually start at my high quality is usually going to be right around here, to be honest. This particular image was a little bit different in general cases. This particular scene, we start to get into good enough quality at around 8. Generally speaking, I find it the good enough quality for me, and again, it will be different for you to experiment in your own scenes, is going to be at 16. So 1:16.01. And then also keep in mind that I like to turn that down to 0.1. Actually, at this point, because the maximum value is 16, changing that to 0.1 or 0.01 doesn't really make a difference, because it's already sampling enough samples here to take care of any problems here. So it's really not going to make a big difference. It'll only really make a difference if this was like at 4 or 1 or anything like that. So it doesn't really make a difference. I actually don't even touch this. What I do is I make sure that my depth amount is about 1, which is going to be a good thing for me. So with that is basically where I start. Okay, when I have extremely bright areas, which we have a few in here, like this. Okay, it's not really affecting my scene that much, but sometimes when there's a high or with a low glossiness and the really broad speculars, get an extremely bright areas, get these little speckly dots that happen from specular highlights. There's several ways to solve that, but basically what you need to do is start to think about lowering some of these or getting even higher quality. And I've gone in several scenes, I've started my default at 1:25.005, and that can pretty much give me most of what I need. Again, this scene took a long time to render, and I didn't need to go at this level of quality, but in some scenes you'll notice that 1:25.05 will actually render fairly quickly and never be that much of a problem. Okay, so what I've also noticed is that if there's certain very difficult situations where just highlights are just sparkling like crazy, etc., I may need to go up to 50, if not 80. Okay, but very, very, very rarely. I would say that this value here would probably get you 90% there. You may need to go lower than that, 0.02, 0.01, etc., which I think is basically what we wind up in this scene, right? Sorry, I can't remember. But anyway, this values will probably get you where you need to be 90-95% of the way, and you may need to go to 95. That's going to be like 99% of the time, or 99.9% of the time. Really, very rarely do you have to go above this level of quality for a scene. That is my basic understanding, or my basic feeling of the situation. Again, I would encourage you to find your own and go from there. So with that said, I really encourage you guys to look into this specific scene and play with different settings if you want, as well as look into your own scenes and try these different methodologies and see what best suits your needs, because your needs may not involve as much a need for glossy rays and QMC, and you may find that adaptive subdivision is a better method for you. I would just encourage you to keep in mind that the method that I outlined can actually be extremely powerful and get you results very, very quickly, and allow you to throw in things like depth of field and motion blur and glossy rays, etc., much faster without having to worry about the quality at that point. So with that said, hopefully you guys can look into this. All the scene files should be in there, minus a certain texture and the HDR files, etc. But you can definitely use your own HDRs, or just use whatever lighting you would like to use. But the scene is really sort of made for an HDR dome light scenario. And then experiment with it and have fun, and hopefully you'll be able to raise the quality of your images and your renderings as well. Thank you.